Okay, so here's the second part of the human body systems. So we're going to pick up where we left off in lecture. Last time we were talking about the cardiovascular system. So here we're moving on to the endocrine system. So this system is a system that helps regulate the body, helps keep the body within its optimal range, and it does so by releasing messengers that are going to be chemical messengers that are called hormones. So these messengers, they are produced by glands like the ones that you're seeing here, distributed throughout the body. And the gland secretions will jump into the bloodstream and then go to other parts of the body where they're going to have their effect. So here, what you're looking at is like the pancreas. We have the adrenal glands. So not the kidneys that you're seeing, but the little glands on top of the kidneys. Those are called the adrenal glands. There's also a thyroid, which is near the thyroid cartilage or running over the thyroid cartilage, at the top of the windpipe. And then we have a tiny structure here that's called the hypothalamus, and that connects to the pituitary gland in the head area. And then at the bottom, we have the gonads. Those are also considered endocrine organs. So it would be like the testes for male and the ovaries for the female. So here's that hypothalamus that I mentioned. It is part of a brain, part of the brain. It is considered a neuroendocrine structure because it does participate in the nervous system as part of the brain, but it also controls the endocrine system, so it also plays a role in this system as well. So essentially, it tells the pituitary gland when to secrete hormones, and then the pituitary gland is the little ovalish sac-like structure at the bottom of the hypothalamus, which is here. So this is pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland does have its two lobes, but it's just generally referred to as the pituitary gland. The anterior lobe produces six important hormones, like growth hormone, prolactin, and then the posterior pituitary produces two hormones like oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Then we have the parathyroid glands. So these are the little reddish structures that you're seeing embedded within the thyroid gland. So the two are right next to each other, but they have their separate functions. So parathyroid glands, these are the main glands that regulate your calcium levels when it produces parathyroid hormone. And it helps to increase calcium levels in the blood. And then the thyroid gland is what's surrounding the parathyroid glands. So that's the gland that's shaped more like a butterfly. That one produces thyroid hormone, which um, is the main hormone that's involved in regulating your metabolism. The pancreas, this gland, um, helps monitor your sugar levels and also helps control your sugar levels. So when you eat a meal, your glucose levels, which again, glucose, that's a type of sugar, your glucose levels are going to increase. And in response to that, your pancreas will detect the high glucose levels in your blood and it will produce insulin, which is the hormone. And then insulin, it signals cells in the body, like your muscle cells, your uh, liver cells, your fat cells, to take in glucose from the bloodstream and to store it. So when glucose is removed from the bloodstream, it lowers the glucose levels in the blood. So that's how your blood sugar levels go down. If you have uh, low blood sugar or low glucose in your blood, then your pancreas produces another hormone called glucagon. And that one does the reverse. It will signal things like the liver to break down that glycogen that it had stored and turn it back into glucose. Then we have the adrenal glands here. So these are glands that are involved in things like the body's response to stress. So they do produce hormones like aldosterone, cortisol. Cortisol also helps uh, increase blood sugar levels because when your body's in stress, It wants glucose in the blood at a high level so that the cells can use that energy as a nutrient. And then the testes and ovaries, so these are gonads, so these are sex organs. Um, in the male reproductive system, the testes do produce testosterone, so that would be the hormone. And in the female reproductive system, the ovaries produce estrogen. So these hormones are involved in developing those secondary sexual characteristics. So that would be like for the males, it'd be like the pubic hair, the facial hair, and so forth. For females, secondary sexual characteristics would be like the development of breasts and also pubic hair. All right. But here we're looking at a feedback mechanism. So this is how the body maintains homeostasis when it comes to glucose levels in the blood, because it does produce two hormones, the insulin and the glucagon. So here if we track, well, actually, we'll go over both. Um, so let's see. So glucose levels do have a normal concentration where the body wants it. Uh, so this is a blood concentration that is considered optimal for the body. And so it wants to remain within that range. But there are things that could, certain stimuli that will throw it off that range. So, for example, if we have an increase in blood glucose level after you eat a large meal, then your glucose levels will go up in your bloodstream because after you eat the food, your body's going to digest it. And then, as we saw with the digestive system, most of those nutrients will be absorbed by your small intestine and eventually they're going to end up in your bloodstream because surrounding the small intestine, there's blood vessels. So when nutrients like glucose are absorbed by the small intestine, they will end up in the blood vessels, and so they're going to be in the bloodstream. So if you have too much glucose in the bloodstream, this is where the pancreas detects that increased sugar level, and then it's going to release insulin as a response. The insulin is produced by the pancreas, and then it also jumps into the bloodstream through blood vessels, because that's how hormones are travel through the body is by jumping into the bloodstream. There are no ducts that connect the gland to their target tissues, so it has to go through the bloodstream in order to reach their target tissues. So in this case, the pancreas produces the insulin. Insulin goes into the bloodstream and then will go to its target cells, which would be, again, like the muscle cells and the liver cells. And it'll stimulate those cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream and store it as glycogen. Um, Eventually, once the glucose in the blood is absorbed by the cells, then glucose levels will drop until it reaches homeostasis. Once the homeostasis is reached, the pancreas stops producing insulin because there's no longer a need to reduce glucose levels in the blood, so it just stops producing it. But if you go the other route, like if you haven't eaten in a while, if you're fasting, your glucose levels will drop, and then in that scenario, your pancreas releases another hormone called glucagon, and this hormone targets the organs like the liver to release their stored glucose back into the bloodstream. And so when the glucose goes back into the bloodstream, then it increases glucose levels in the blood until it reaches homeostasis. Once that's reached, then the pancreas stops producing glucagon, and that maintains homeostasis. Okay. For the urinary system, this is how your body filters the blood. So your kidneys are constantly receiving blood because, as you can see here, there is a big blood vessel that runs down the body all the way down into the abdomen. So it's called the aorta or the descending aorta. And it does branch off into smaller blood vessels. They're called the renal arteries in this case because they deliver blood into the kidneys. So kidneys are constantly receiving blood and they're constantly filtering that blood. So this is how your body excretes things like metabolic waste that gets that's flowing through your blood. So they are paired. You do have two kidneys, and they're located at the back of your abdomen, so on the back wall. Um, they are slightly off. They're not exactly at the same level, and that's because you have a big organ on the right side of the body. It's called the liver, and so because of that, the right kidney is slightly lower than the left. But that's how that gets his blood and how blood leaves the kidney. It goes in through the renal artery, which is the red one. That's a branch off of the aorta. And then the blood is filtered within the kidney tissue. And then the blood is returned back to circulation through the renal veins, which would be the blue ones. Eventually, those renal veins they merge into the vena cava, and this returns the blood back to the heart. Other part of the urinary system, besides the kidneys, are these long tubes. They're called ureters. So they connect the kidneys to this sac-like structure. It's called the urinary bladder. That's where the urine is stored. So the urinary bladder doesn't really manipulate or filter or change the concentration of the urine. All that happens within the kidney. The bladder just holds it. It's just an organ that stores the urine that's already produced. Then eventually it will empty out through the urethra. So where the urinary bladder kind of narrows in inferiorly, so to the bottom, that's called the urethra, and that's how the urine is excreted from the body. Okay, but these are the actual filtration units that filter the blood within the kidney. So these are called nephrons. These are tiny. So these are actually like this one here is not actually drawn to scale. It's just um, drawn bigger than it is because it's for illustrative purposes, so you can see the actual detail. But there's millions of these in each kidney. So these are tiny microscopic tube-like structures that are within the kidney tissue, and that's how the blood is it's filtered. So if you look closely here, there's arrows indicating the flow of the blood. So it arrives through the red blood vessel, which would be an artery. So these are tiny branches off of that renal artery that turn into smaller arteries that eventually turn into arterioles, which are small versions of arteries. But the blood goes in here into this uh, circular structure called the renal corpuscle. But here's where the blood is separated from or the two components of blood are separated. Because blood has red blood cells, and it also has plasma, which is the fluid portion of blood. The plasma, the fluid portion, is the one that gets pushed out, and the red blood cells they remain in the blood vessels at all times, so they'll return back to the circulation. The plasma that's pushed out, and so that's part of that filtration process, then goes through this series of tubes. So these are called convoluted tubules. So there's like a proximal tubule, there's this loop here called the loop of Henle. So it goes through a series of tubes, and as it's running through these tubes, this is where the filtrate, that fluid that was produced by the blood plasma, this is where water is adjusted and also solutes. So you can have solutes going, and by solutes I mean things like sodium, like potassium. You can have solutes going from the tubes back into the bloodstream by going into these blood vessels, or you can have them going from the blood vessels into the tubes on their way to excretion. Same thing with water. Water can either go from the blood vessels into the tube and be on its way to be excreted as urine, or it can go from the tubes back into the blood vessels and and be retained within the body. Okay. But that's how the urine is kind of manipulated. So it's kind of adjusted based on your body's needs. If you're properly hydrated, then your body would not need to conserve water. In that case, you flush more water goes from your blood vessels to the tubes, and you produce a very dilute urine. If you're dehydrated, if you haven't had water all day, then your body's going to want to conserve as much water as possible. And so in that case, water returns back to circulation. So it goes from these tubes back into the blood vessels. And then that produces a more concentrated and small volume of urine. Here's just to give you an idea of what the urine is made up of. And it's mainly water. So it's water is 94% of the urine because the urine is created from the blood plasma that was filtered initially. And plasma is also mainly water. But then there's also these other solutes that are going to be a part of that urine concentration. So there's chloride, sodium, potassium, and so forth. But these are just to give you an idea of what goes in urine. You don't have to actually know these solids. So here we're looking at dialysis treatment. So this is what essentially needs to be done when somebody doesn't have properly functioning kidneys that do the filtration for the body. They filter the blood. Um, when the kidneys are no longer functioning the way that they're supposed to, the waste can accumulate in the bloodstream, and that does become toxic. So it leads to death. So dialysis is a way to filter the blood with a machine, because the kidneys aren't functioning properly. So moving on to the nervous system. So the nervous system does have two divisions. There's a central nervous system, which just includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's a peripheral nervous system, which includes the nerves that are branching off of the the brain and the spinal cord. So those are just the nerve. One division is just the nerves that branch off of the other division. The nervous system, it does function by receiving signals, um, transferring those signals to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system processes that information and then relays the appropriate action back out to the body. So the peripheral nervous system would be the one that collects those signals because you have nerves all throughout your body. When signals are collected, they eventually end up in the central nervous system. So it could be the spinal cord or it could be the brain. And then that information is going to be integrated. So it's going to be your brain or your nervous system will decide what the appropriate action is going to be to those signals that are incoming, and then send the signal back out to the appropriate body part through the nerves that you're seeing. Okay. So yeah, so I mentioned the brain. That's the key component of the central nervous system. There's also the spinal cord because there's some signals that do have to go from the outer extremity. A signal is collected and has to reach the spinal cord first, and then it's relayed to the brain. Um, there are some signals that don't reach the brain; they just end up at the spinal cord, and then from there, if it's involved in some kind of reflex where the brain is not involved, it just sends a signal back out from the spinal cord. But those are the key components: the brain and the spinal cord, because they are the area where once a signal is collected, it's going to arrive there, and that's where it's integrated. That's where the body decides what to do in response to that signal that arrived there. There's also cerebral spinal fluid. So this fluid does a lot of things. It surrounds the brain, where it's produced within the brain, and it also eventually surrounds the brain, and it also runs through the spinal cord. So in the brain area, it does have various functions. This is what allows the brain to uh, not to get too much damage when the skull is rattled. That spinal fluid kind of acts as a cushion. It also makes the brain buoyant, so that means that it's slightly afloat within the skull, so that it doesn't damage itself by its own weight. Because the skull, like the cranium, that's all bone. If there were no spinal fluid or no connective tissues around the brain, then just the weight of the brain itself would damage the brain. Because when it's sitting on top of a bony structure, like the bottom part of the brain would be damaged if there was no cerebral spinal fluid. So yeah, it plays various roles that are important for the nervous system. Here's just to give an idea of the how the nervous system operates. So you always have things like sensory input. This is information that's collected by sensory neurons. So these are neurons that are connected to receptors that are found throughout your body. So you can have like pain receptors, mechanoreceptors, thermal receptors. They're all throughout your body and they're connected to neurons. So when they're stimulated, the signal just travels through the nerves and then goes to the nervous system or the central nervous system, like the brain or the spinal cord. And that's where the integration happens. So from there, there's these interneurons that connect. They act like a middle neuron. So they're between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. The sensory neurons collect information, then that information goes through the interneuron, and then it's sent back out to body parts from the central nervous system through these motor neurons. Um, so like for this diagram, the sensory information is being received by like the nerves that are like the body that's being used, like the nerves on the leg here, also sensory information from the eyes and so forth. That information gets sent to the central nervous system, where eventually it's integrated and the body decides how to respond to that information. So if you're bouncing a ball, that's the information that your body's going to process. Then it relays that information through the interneuron to the motor neurons to kind of have an effect um, to to deal with that sensory information that was collected. So the motor neurons are the ones that actually stimulate your leg muscles to contract, and so that allows you to move your leg to continue to bounce the ball. Yeah. But this system, the nervous system, that's how your body communicates and coordinates uh, through various networks. Um, so it's also so it's similar to the endocrine system where signals are also being sent. The difference is that in the nervous system, uh, things happen a lot faster. So those signals are going to happen a lot faster because it's involving neurons that are sending impulses. So they're sending electrical signals from one neuron to another. But it doesn't last as long. Whereas in the endocrine system, the signal that's being sent or the messenger is the hormone that has to travel through the bloodstream, so it takes longer for it to have an effect, but it does last longer. But here you're seeing the just one neuron, one nerve cell, and just the various components of it. So it is a cell. It is going to have organelles within the cell. So as you can see here, there's a big oval in the center. That would be like the nucleus of the cell. So this whole thing is a nerve cell, and it's referred to as a neuron. The neuron collects information through these little branches that are surrounding the body of the neuron. It's called the cell body. And then once it receives those signals, it initiates another signal that leaves the body of the neuron through this long branch. It's called the axon. And eventually, at the end of that axon, there's chemicals that are released. These are called neurotransmitters. Um, and these can vary. I mean, there's various types of neurotransmitters. Like dopamine, that's a neurotransmitter. Uh, epinephrine, that's a neurotransmitter, and so forth. But that's how the signal travels. First, there's an electrical signal that's initiated here at this initial part. That electrical signal, which is it's known as an impulse, travels through the axon, and then once it reaches the end of the axon, it'll convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal because it triggers the release of these chemicals, these neurotransmitters. And this is what I'm referring to as an electrical signal. So it is referred to as an impulse. Um, and what that is it's the movement of charges from the inside of the cell to the outside. So here you can see that it says interior of axon because we are looking at the inside of this branch of the neuron, which is called the axon. So at rest, the inside of cells in general, they do have a negative charge to them. Um, but when you have certain channels that open, that allows for ions like sodium to go in. And because sodium does have a positive charge to it, when sodium goes from the outside of the cell into the cell, it does change the charge. So it turns the inside more positive. And it does so at various points within the axon. When those charges go from negative to positive, that's the actual impulse that's being generated. And when it travels from one area to another, that's the impulse traveling across the axon. So as those channels are continuing to open and allowing sodium to go into the axon, it's changing the charges within it, and that's generating the impulse. So it allows for that signal to travel from one part to the next part to the next part and so forth till it reaches the very end. Once it reaches the end, this junction where one nerve cell interacts with another nerve cell, because you can see here, this is a neuron, and this part here is labeled as receiving cell. That means that this is another neuron. So there's always a neuron that sends the signal, and there's going to be a neuron that receives the signal. So the part where they communicate, it's called the synapse, and this is where neurotransmitters are released. So they have to travel across the synapse and then bind to the receptors on the receiving uh, neuron or receiving cell. Okay. So here now we're going to jump into the skeletal system. So here's some fun trivia related to bones. So the human body does have 206 bones, and the smallest bones in the body. So you would think that it would be the like some area like the little finger, but no. The actual area that has the smallest bone is going to be the ear, because your middle ear is made up of three tiny ear bones that help you with things like hearing, because they vibrate when sound waves go into the ear. Uh, so they're really tiny. So the ear is actually the area where you have the smallest bone. It's called the stapes. But the skeletal system, this system does include the skeleton. It does provide support for your muscles because the muscles have to attach to the skeleton. Um, they also protect your vital organs. So, for example, your rib cage, that's where your heart is found within the rib cage, your lungs, the skull is what protects your brain, and so forth. So, it does serve that purpose, provides support, and it also protects organs. And it does have two divisions. So, there is a division that's called the axial skeleton, that just includes the skull, the the vertebral column, which is be the spine, and the rib cage. That's the axial. Appendicular is what makes up your limbs. So like your upper limbs, lower limbs, and also like the hip bones. Those are all part of the appendicular. Here you're just seeing just the type of tissue that's found in bone. So the bone does have things like blood vessels running within it. So it is considered to be vascularized. So any tissue that's vascular, that means that it has blood vessels within it, because not all tissue does that. For example, um, well, things like cartilage, the cartilage tissue is not vascularized itself, um, but the bone does have blood vessels. So they run within the bone. There's a cavity within bone that's called well, it's called the medullary cavity. You don't have to know that, but that is where blood vessels are running through, and also bone marrow is found. With associated with bone are ligaments. So ligaments are a type of connective tissue that connects one bone to another bone. And you see these ligaments at joints. So here you see various examples of joints, like the joints where the bones of your skull meet and stay connected, your elbow joint, your shoulder joint. What helps keep one bone attached to another bone is a ligament. Here's some issues associated with the skeletal system. So there's obviously like fractures where you have a bone tissue that's broken. There's arthritis. This is an inflammation of the joints, um, where the cushion that should be at joints kind of wears out, and so you have more bone rubbing up against another bone, and so that causes inflammation, um, and so that's referred to as arthritis. Then you have osteoporosis, where you have low, um, um, the bones have low, they have low density because of the lack of minerals. So in bone tissue, calcium is stored in it, and that's what makes it hard. So that's the mineral that gives bone its hard properties. But in a situation with osteoporosis, that's where you have low minerals. So not a lot of minerals within the bone tissue, so it makes them more brittle. All right, and the last system here is going to be the muscular system. So this involves the muscle within your body. So that's the skeletal muscle, like the one that you're seeing here, but also includes cardiac, which is the muscle that makes up your heart, and smooth muscle, which is the muscle that is making up your organs. There is a difference between the two. The skeletal muscle is the one that you contract voluntarily. So anything that you can move consciously is considered is a skeletal muscle. The smooth muscle would be, and also cardiac would be muscle that contracts on its own. So you don't control when it moves. And this is what the muscles are made of. They're made up of these muscle cells. They're called muscle fibers. These are cylindrical cells that are making up the muscle organ. Because each muscle that you can think of, like your deltoid, your biceps, that's considered an organ because it is made up of tissues. Um, and so those tissues they are made up of these muscle cells that are called muscle fibers. The muscle fibers, they consist of um, these bundles of proteins called myofibrils, because if you zoom in to those muscle fibers, that's what makes up the cell. It's these protein bundles that are called myofibrils. And the protein bundles, they do form a contractile unit. So this is how muscle contracts. One contractile unit is referred to as a sarcomere. And so when you do have a muscle contraction, there's going to be overlap that occurs. So there's thin filaments, so that would be the thin myofibrils, so a thin protein, and a thick filament, um, which is a thick protein. So there's myosin and actin. Actin is the thin one, myosin is the thick one. There is overlap with those two proteins. And so when there is a muscle contraction, you just go from a situation where there's a slight overlap to a lot of overlap. And so when you have thousands of these doing it, that leads to one muscle contraction. Uh, that's how that works. So it's through these myofilaments that are overlapping with each other, and when they're stimulated, they're gonna go from a position of slight overlap to a position of a lot of overlap, and that's what leads to a muscle contraction. But it's not just one individual sarcomere that generates a muscle contraction. There's thousands of these, depending on the muscle group that you're looking at. And this is what happens from a different viewpoint. So this is a more zoomed in um, diagram. Here you're seeing the thick filament or the part of the thick filament that connects to the thin filament. So this would be the myosin that I mentioned. This one would be the actin. And so I'm mainly pointing at the orange part. So it begins by actin. Well, let's start here. So the myosin head will have to bind to actin, and this is just a part of the thick filament that attaches, called the myosin head. It binds to actin. It's going to generate a stroke. It's called the power stroke, and it kind of pushes it or pulls it towards the middle. That's what you're seeing here. This red one connected to the blue one and forcing it more towards the middle. Once it does that, it'll stay locked in that position until there's an energy molecule that detaches it. So ATP has to come in and bind to the myosin head for it to detach, and then the myosin head is going to turn that ATP into ADP and become energized again and ready to attach to the actin again. So throughout one muscle contraction, this will happen, many times. So it's not just it'll do it once and then generate one muscle contraction. No, this happens many times over and over. Okay, but this is how a muscle contraction cycle works. Um, and this is actually also how rigor mortis works. Is that during rigor mortis, this is where your body is dead, obviously, and so you're no longer producing ATP. Um, so if your muscle cells are um, attached, so like these fibers of the muscle cell are connected to each other, there's no ATP to break that attachment, and so you kind of get locked into a contracted state. So that's rigor mortis, where your body's stiff, and it kind of remains in the position. The muscles remain contracted, and they're in the in one certain position, sorry, position, because there is no ATP to break that bridge that was formed. Eventually, rigor mortis goes away, but that's just because the proteins themselves start to break down just through the decaying process. Okay, but that's going to be the end of the slideshow. So this will be the last of the materials that's going to be presented on the exam. And so, yeah, so that's going to be it for the materials of the class.